My dear friends, once we experience a life in the human situation, we experience some hurt. There's no one in this beautiful cathedral this evening who has not at one time or another been hurt. Perhaps one has been hurt by a spouse who deserted us. Perhaps one has been hurt by a friend who betrayed us. Perhaps one has been hurt by an employer or an employee. It's possible that we have been hurt by a parent who might have been too protective, or a parent who has been too aggressive. Perhaps we have been hurt by a representative of the church, by a priest, a religious consecrated woman, a bishop, an archbishop. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter from whence the hurt came. What really matters is what I am going to do when I experience hurt. Because the emotion that wells up within me when I am hurt is an emotion of revenge. You hurt me, and I'm going to get back to you, and perhaps it will be done with some cold civility, but it will be done. And you will regret the fact that you have hurt me. This is the immediate emotion that any one of us has when we are hurt. And I ask myself, how can I forgive anyone who has hurt me so? And it is not a matter of whether or not I can, it is a matter of how I do it, because forgiving and letting go is not an option for the Christian. It is the command of Jesus Christ. Be forgiving as your heavenly Father has forgiven you. But how do I do this? How does a child forgive a parent who has been too lenient or too protective or too aggressive? How does a spouse forgive another spouse who has betrayed him or her? How does one forgive an employer or an employee who has betrayed the other? How do we enter into this process of forgiveness? Well, a very simple process which I will outline for you this evening is one which is spiritually sound and one which is psychologically sound. The very first thing one must do when one has been hurt, and that hurt is being carried within us almost like a burning flame of anguish. The very first thing one must do is to admit the hurt. To be able to say to self, I was hurt by this parent, I was hurt by this priest, I was hurt by this bishop, I was hurt by my spouse. To be able to admit that, because some of us would like to sweep that under a rug and act as though it never happened. And when we do this, it's going to come out in some ugly way. Someone who is going to sound like the person who hurt us is going to receive vibrations of our contempt. Or if someone looks like that person, or if someone is a person in a position of authority, and we have not dealt with a hurt, we are going to respond negatively to that person. I recall quite vividly that when I returned to the Albany Diocese in 1979, after having been absent for about 14 years, Bishop Hubbard asked me to visit every priest in the diocese and to come up with some kind of growth plan. Pies, physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And then to come back to that priest in 6 months and ask, how are we doing? Well, I would leave Albany at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and then travel to some part of the diocese and sit down with a priest for a couple of hours, come up with a growth plan, and then have dinner with him, and then be on my way. Well, on one occasion, I was in the Mohawk Valley, and the pastor said to me, would it be all right with you if we had dinner tonight at the convent? And I said, yes. So that evening we walked across the street, and the sisters were there and greeted us very warmly. And the priest went into the kitchen to make proximate preparation with the sisters for the dinner, and sat me down in a very small parlor with one sister whom I never met before in my life. And she proceeded to pick up a newspaper and begin to read it. And trying to make conversation, I said to her, it's mighty cold out there tonight, isn't it? Thinking to myself, it's like an iceberg sitting in this small room with you. And then I asked myself, what is going on here? I never met this person in my life. There's no way I could ever have hurt her or any of her friends. And then I realized I came from the bishop's office. She had a hang-up with authority. And she thought I had authority. I had no authority whatsoever. I came up with a growth plan with a priest. I went home. I came back in 6 months to see how we were doing, and the bishop never even saw that growth plan. But somewhere along the line, that sister was hurt by someone in authority and had never really dealt with it. And it's like a cancer within us. It's raging unless we deal with it. So the very first step entering into that process of forgiveness is to admit the hurt. To be able to say, yes, on such and such an occasion, I was hurt by this parent. There's nothing wrong in admitting that. You're not disgracing your parent. You're not rejecting them. You're simply admitting a fact. And there's nothing as stubborn as a fact. And then the next step, to turn to the Spirit of Jesus Christ. In all of our homes, we have a crucifix. We walk into this beautiful church and we see this crucifix. At the end of our rosaries, we have a crucifix. At our desk, we have a crucifix. And I believe that we have seen the sight of that crucifix so often, it has cloyed our tastes spiritually. It doesn't have the meaning as it should to any one of us anymore. But to turn to the Spirit of Jesus Christ and to ask ourselves, was anyone on earth ever more hurt than was Jesus Christ during the last week of his life on earth? This man, God-man, who came to preach justice. This God-man who came to preach reverence for one another. This God-man, Jesus Christ, who would teach lesson upon lesson about forgiveness, turning the other cheek, forgiving not 7 times, but 70 times 7. This God-man who would teach lessons about leaving your gift at the altar before making an offering to God and going and making peace with your brother and sister, and then come and make your gift to God. This God-man, Jesus Christ, who would be hanging from that cross and still found it within himself to utter those words, Father, forgive them. And then to find a reason for their stupidity. They don't even know what they are doing. To turn to the Spirit of Jesus Christ and to take that crucifix in one's hand and say, what does this mean? And what is this saying about me? To turn to the Spirit of Jesus Christ who would teach lessons of forgiveness over and over and over again. And while that mad crowd was storming and calling out his name and obscenities to him, would still find it within himself to say, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. And then in that garden, when he was betrayed by one of his friends, who had an insult to injury by betraying him with a kiss, to turn to the Spirit of Jesus Christ and let that Spirit somehow get within us. And then the very next step, to articulate our forgiveness. If the person has gone to God, then write out a letter of forgiveness and leave it at our bedstand for a couple of weeks and then destroy it. But to get it from in here out here. Or if the person is still living, to go to that person and say, I don't know whether or not you know it, but on such and such an occasion you hurt me. And I'm working on forgiveness and I want to forgive you. And if I've done anything to offend you, please forgive me. Now that's a chancy thing to do, because that person might say to us, well, you deserve that and then some. And then we might have a little more to deal with, but at least before God we know that we are serious about this work of forgiveness and reconciliation. And if it doesn't seem wise to go to that person and articulate it verbally, then do it in writing. But to get it from in here out here. So to admit the hurt, to turn to the Spirit of Jesus Christ, to express my forgiveness in some way. And then the next step, begin to let go. Monsignor Segura, that beloved priest of this Archdiocese, of this diocese, said to me, and used to say it often, turn the page, Bishop, turn the page. Begin to let go. There are certain personalities, and I've never quite understood them, who love to have a hurt. And love to take it out on a Monday morning, especially if it's raining, and shine it up and then put it back on the shelf until the next Monday. They don't want to let go. They want to hold on to it and hold on to it as though it were a precious diamond. Let go of it. When I was pastor of St. Ambrose in Latham, New York, there was plenty of land around the rectory, the school, the church, plenty of parking space, and loads of property. So much so that the Little Sisters of the Poor took some of it and built a magnificent home for the aged poor. But a group of young men came to me one day and they asked me if they could use some of that land in order to make a ball field. And being a good pastor, Father Chester, I said, how much will it cost? And they said, it won't cost a cent. Well, I said, then go and dig as much as you want. And so they came up with a ball field, and they had a softball team, and they were playing another team on a very hot July evening, and they won. And they crossed the Hudson River to Watervliet, and they went to a place called the Purple Pub. And one of them drank beer, and he drank beer, and he drank beer. And he never should have gotten behind the wheels of a car that evening, but he did. And on his way home, there was a head-on collision. And the young woman driving the other car had just graduated from Niagara University in upstate New York with her degree in nursing. She was going to the midnight shift at St. Peter's Medical Center in Albany, and that head-on collision, and she was killed. And the young fella from my parish, father of 3 young babies, was driving the other car. And I went with his wife the following day, when he finally woke up, to tell him that there had been a terrible accident, that he had killed someone, and that he was going to be indicted. He was indicted, he went to trial, and he faced one of the toughest judges in the city of Albany, and was sentenced from 5 to 15 years in a state prison. There was one witness to that accident, and that gentleman testified as he should have done. But when the poor fellow from my parish was being led out in the front of his wife and family in handcuffs, the witness was sitting in the front pew, first seat, whispered a terrible, terrible name to the one being led away for prison. A whisper that could have been heard throughout the courtroom. Within a year, there was another accident. But who was driving this time but the witness? A DUI, and someone else was killed. And the young man from my parish wrote me a letter, and it could have been a treatise on grace. He said, "Dear Father, you remember that man I was telling you about and what he called me when I was being let out to begin my sentence? Well, he had an accident similar to mine, and someone else was killed, and he was just sentenced to the same prison as I am living in." And he said, "Father, within me, there came the urge to go down to him and say, 'See, it could happen to anyone, and I hope you suffer as much as I'm suffering.' But then there was another voice, a voice telling me to reach out and heal, not hurt. And Father," he said in the letter which I have saved, "it was like having 2 voices within me, one telling me to hurt and another telling me to heal." And the voice telling him to hurt was not the voice of God. It was not the voice of grace. It was some other voice. But it had nothing to do with God. But the voice telling him to heal was the voice of grace, the voice of God within him. And I'm happy to report that that voice won the day. And the poor fellow from my parish went down to the other part of the prison and said to the other fellow, "We are both in a bad situation. Let's go to AA 3 or 4 nights a week, and let's get out of this together." And both of them are now out of prison, and every Christmas I hear from the poor fellow from my parish with the 3 children, "Thank you for standing next to me during the darkest days of my life." Let go of it. Begin to let go of it. And then to realize that anyone who might have hurt us, that act, even though it might have been committed with malice aforethought, is only part of that person's life. Would any one of us ever want to be judged by one act or another? Wouldn't every one of us want to be judged by the totality of our lives, by all the good that have been accomplished by each one? Wouldn't all of us want to be judged as looking at the totality of our lives? And the totality of every life, I believe, is mighty good. And even though there might be some horrific act here or there or otherwise, that's one thing, and we look at the person's whole life and then try to see that person through that whole life. We look at someone who's angry with parents. Well, who bathed you? Who gave you life? Who fed you when you weren't able to feed yourself? That parent. Chesterton speaks about two people walking into a room, and there's a new rug on the floor, and there's a spot on the rug. And in this particular essay, he writes that some people walk in and say, my, what a beautiful, beautiful rug. And some other personalities, for whatever reason, look at the spot, look at the spot, look at the spot. And we can find them in parishes too, believe it or not. But to be able to see the totality of the picture as God will look at us mercifully, and seeing all the good that we've done. And then finally, to realize if that person has hurt us, again with malice aforethought, and then has gone to God and has asked for forgiveness, God has already forgiven that person. And am I going to stand over here outside the salvation, the salvific work of God, that salvific work of forgiveness, and say, I will not forgive? Now, my dear friends, what I've been talking about this evening is a process. One can't do it in one day. It takes time. And if we enter the process, it might keep coming back to us and coming back. That's not our fault at all. But we begin again until one day we are free. It's part of any hurt is part of our experience. But we want to be like God. And God speaks to Jeremiah, and God, in speaking about each one of us, says, I will remember their sins no longer, and I will forget all their iniquities. So our God is a God who forgives and forgets. And we want to be like God as much as possible, but it is a process because we are human beings. C.S. Lewis was terribly, his childhood was terribly darkened by a bully of a school teacher in England. And he tried to forgive that school teacher over and over, and it seemed as though he never could really get past that initial stage of forgiveness. Then nearing the end of his life, he wrote to a friend, and he said, I think I have finally forgiven that school teacher who so darkened my childhood. It's taken me a long time, but I think at long last I have forgiven you. Dear friends, forgiveness is possible. Dr. Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist, and he and his family all suffered terribly at Dachau, that terrible concentration camp. And his family were all destroyed, and Dr. Frankl, an outstanding psychiatrist, survived it. He was a child at the time. And one evening in 1969, he was giving a talk at Temple University in Philadelphia on this very subject, the subject of forgiveness. And at the end of his talk, a young woman in the back of the auditorium raised her hand and she said, Dr. Frankl, do you mean to tell me you forgave Adolf Hitler for what he did to you and your family? And Frankl looked at her and he said, if I did not forgive him, I would have become as insane as he was. And if we don't forgive, if we deliberately hold on to something, that interferes with our ability to love, with our ability to trust. It interferes in our relationships in family and all the rest. One of the great moments for the Catholic Church occurred in 1986. On the front page of the New York Times was a story. A young police officer named Stephen McDonald had just married. His wife was pregnant with their first child. And there had been a rash of armed robberies in a certain neighborhood, and he was on his way home to his pregnant wife one evening and went through that particular neighborhood. He saw a group of young men standing on the corner, and they looked rather suspicious. So he stopped his car and he got out and he said, "What's going on?" And one of them, whose name was Sherrod Jones, took a gun out of his pocket, shot Stephen McDonald, and left him lying in the gutter bleeding to death. A woman from one of the apartments saw the event. She called the police. She called 911. They came, picked up Stephen McDonald, and brought him to Bellevue Hospital, which was close by. He chose the occasion of the baptism of his son, who was born shortly after that, to make his statement. But he was a paraplegic. Stephen was paralyzed in his legs and in his arms and needed assistance with breathing. His wife, Hattie McDonald, read his statement because he could not speak with all the breathing tubes. And the New York Times reported the scene. Stephen McDonald sitting there with rosary in his hand, and his wife, Patty, reading his statement with tears streaming down her cheeks. She read the statement, and the statement was, as I quote, "I forgive the man who has done this to me. And it is my hope and prayer that he will find peace and meaning in his life." Fast forward to last summer, 25 or 26 years later, on the front page of the New York News, beautiful picture of Stephen McDonald, the paraplegic, and his wife with arms around him. The son is now a police officer in New York City, and the title was Unwavering Faith. Faith in God, faith in his forgiveness, faith in his love and in his providence. And when that New York Times article appeared, it stated, and don't forget this, it was his Catholic faith which permitted such forgiveness. What a shining moment for the church. Dear friends, am I holding a grudge? Am I holding a grudge? And if I am, what do I want to do about it?